pediatric critical care specialist at Phoenix Children's Hospital, having served as Division Chief of Critical Care Medicine for over 23 years, and is Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, Phoenix, where he directs the Ethics and Humanism theme for the medical school and also directs the Global Health Program. He also serves as the chairman of the Bioethics Committee of Phoenix Children's Hospital. Dr. Beyda attended Loyola University Stritch School of Medicine, completed his pediatric residency at the University of Louisville Kosar Children's Hospital, and completed his pediatric critical care fellowship training at Johns Hopkins University. He was appointed as a visiting fellow and scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics and the Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where he completed his training in medical ethics.
You're welcome.
His expertise is in the area of neuroresuscitation, medical ethics, and third world medicine. His research interests involve the investigation of the cause and effect of pediatric submersion injuries, the measurement of cerebral blood flow and metabolism in brain-injured children, and the ethical issues related to end-of-life in children. Dr. Beyda is a member of numerous professional societies and organizations, including the Society of Critical Care Medicine, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Association of Bioethics. In addition to being a nationally and internationally recognized author and guest lecturer, Dr. Beyda also volunteers his expertise abroad. He founded and is a member of the board of directors of the Children's Heart Project, which provides comprehensive cardiovascular care to children in Sri Lanka. He is the founder and medical director of Medical Mercy, the medical arm of One Child Matters, traveling 6 to 8 times a year to care for children in over 20 countries, a few of which are Cambodia, Egypt, Mozambique, Kenya, and Ethiopia. Since 2004, he has led over 55 medical trips to third world countries. He is a pilot, physician, does his bush flying in Africa, takes his medical teams to isolated areas of Africa. Dr. Beyda has also been the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Society of Critical Care Medicine's Annual Scientific Award, the J. Kip Charlton Humanitarian Award for Community Service, and the Rocky Mountain Emmy Award. Most recently, he received the Humanitarian Awards from both the Arizona Business Journal and the Arizona Business Magazine, and recognized as a top doc in global health by Phoenix Magazine. He most recently received the Humanitarian Award from the American Academies of Pediatrics. Here is Dr. Beyda.
Well, that's a lot of hoopla. But thank you very much for that kind of introduction. We appreciate the invitation to come here tonight at the inaugural lecture series. And I just want to be very candid with you. I'm going to take you to some places that you may not be very comfortable with. And we're going to have a little level of discomfort. I'm going to step out of bounds a little bit tonight. I'm going to step out of the box. And I'm going to move us in a direction that may get us a little contentious. But I think it's important for us to do so because the issues that we're going to be talking about are going to center around who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do. And so where we're going to go tonight, we're not going to be talking about things that are going to be comfortable. We're going to be talking about things that we don't like to talk about, we don't like to hear, we don't like to see. And we're going to be looking at these issues from different perspectives. I'm going to give you an opportunity to make up your own mind as to where you stand with them. I'm going to take you through the foundations of some basic ethics. We're going to talk about this issue of moral distress. I'm going to take you through this issue of research on the vulnerable. And I'm going to take you back in history and then move us forward to today. And we'll look at this issue of whether ethics is universal or not. And I can share with you right off the bat that, in fact, the answer to that is no. That we just don't do kind things to those who are less fortunate than us. And we'll be looking closely at those who have not in relationship to those who have. And so let me just begin by suggesting that these are interesting times in medicine. We all know that there's about 40 million people who are uninsured. Healthcare reform is coming up. We have these issues with Medicare. We have the cost of health insurance. And we have bedside dilemmas. But what the key issue here is that society looks at us and we are often judged by how well we treat others, especially those who are less fortunate than us. Many of the pictures that you're going to see tonight are my pictures that I've taken in my world travel here in the United States, and in addition, how we treat those who are underprivileged in third world countries. And it's interesting to know that many times there is no difference between the two. And I'm going to take you on that journey and ask you to think about that as we move forward. So let me quickly go through ethics for you and do it in one slide, if you can imagine. There are a significant number of moral theories. There are principles. And I just want to concentrate on principles tonight, because that's what we're going to be doing as we relate everything we're talking about to those who are less fortunate. This concept of autonomy is what we describe as self-directed decision-making. And when you think about it, how often do we truly self-direct our own decisions? And I will share with you in a little bit when we talk about informed consent that in fact we don't. And I'll share with you why. But autonomy as we know it is not necessarily actually in place. This issue of beneficence, and that is doing good for others, well, the title of what we're talking about, and that is the ethics of disjustice or maljustice to the underprivileged, goes against the grain of beneficence. And what about doing no harm? We do harm all the time, whether we know it or not. And then what about this issue of justice, and that's equal care for all? I'll show you that in fact that doesn't exist. No matter how hard we try, you just can't do it. And I'll be moving us in the direction of things called macroallocation, microallocation, and show you that even with the best intention, it's impossible to bring justice to everyone equally, even if we try the hardest. And then there's this issue of veracity, this issue of truth-telling. I just need to tell you that truth-telling in and of itself is such a misnomer that everyone in this room, let me just poll you right now. You've been up, let's say you've all been up since 6 o'clock this morning. By a raise of hands, how many of you have lied at least once today? Raise your hand. I've got one person back there. How many of you have lied to yourself today? How many of you are lying right now? The point is that lying for us has become so habitual that we don't even know we do it. And that's important because when we talk about physician-patient relationships, when we talk about the ethics of the underprivileged, the fact that we lie without even knowing it, and what I mean by lying is either by omission or commission of information, we take advantage of that, and we move in the direction of where we feel most comfortable. Statistics show us that, for example, how many of you are dating in this room? I know you two are dating. All right. Scary statistics. 60% of the time that newly dating couples that have a conversation, 60% of the time, there's at least one lie for every 3 minutes. Have a nice day. We are all lied to an average of 300 times a day. When you meet someone for the very first time, within the first 10 minutes of your conversation, there are 3 lies being passed back and forth, either by embellishment or omission of information. You see that? We become so ingrained that veracity in medicine can't exist in its truest form, which means that we take advantage of it. So when we look at this issue of ethics, can you begin to see how difficult it is for us to even bring the principles of ethics to the bedside and even to those who are underprivileged? Well, let's move forward into something a little bit more distressing, and that's what we call moral distress. And moral distress is when your back is up against the wall because you know what the right thing to do is, but you can't. Either because of administrative policies, hospital policies, you're a subordinate to someone else, you just aren't able to do what you believe is the best and right thing to do. And that's called moral distress. It used to be thought that the great majority of the reasons for burnout for physicians was how hard we worked, et cetera, but that's not the case, and even nurses. The main reason for burnout in the healthcare system today is moral distress, is that we aren't able to do what we believe is right and best for our patients. And so I want you to think about that and just reflect on that for a little bit. And so let me just suggest that there is a foundation for what we're talking about tonight, and that is the difference between healthcare as a right and healthcare as a privilege. Healthcare as a right is described as that which we are entitled to, it's expected, we are due. Privilege is earned. Welcomed is entrusted. I'm going to challenge you again. By show of hands, where do you stand? Healthcare is a right. Raise your hands. How many of you believe that? Healthcare is a privilege. Raise your hands. All right, that's about right. If we were to actually have honesty and veracity here, if people raise their hands, we would see that this community would be split 50-50. Contrary to what everybody thinks, that most people would be on one side or the other. But here's where the catch is. I'm going to challenge you based on where you believe you stood. Healthcare is a right versus healthcare is a privilege. Because it embraces everything that we're going to be talking about and how we do gross injustice to the underprivileged. So the reality of this is, let me take you into an environment. Hot seat. Let me give you an example. We have a 3-person internal medicine practice. They have upper class patients. They take all types of insurance, no Medicaid, no Medicare, co-pays up front. Each of the physicians sees 20 patients a day. They're doing very well. They see about 3 an hour. They earn $350,000 a year. Life is good. Well, guess what? Economy tanks. Fewer patients are able to make the co-pays. Patients are being laid off. They have no insurance, and so the practice starts to fail. The 3 physicians are adding patients to their practice. They make up the difference in income. They're seeing 50 patients a day. They drop their income by half. And they got an issue. They have a front office staff that they have to support. They have nursing assistants. They have nurses. They have PAs. They have a whole host of people that they have to support. They need to make a decision. We're going to come back to healthcare as a right or a privilege. And you perhaps are beginning to see where I'm going with this, because the next step is they now decide to ask all patients who have no insurance to leave the practice because they just can't afford to. So, what do? How do you move from being all good to all of a sudden negating those who aren't privileged or who aren't able to pay? It comes down to this issue of right or privilege. So, when we talk about this, if we truly were on the side of healthcare as a right, those 3 physicians would have to accept that regardless of whether they can pay their front office staff or not, everyone's entitled to healthcare. So it doesn't matter. Everyone can come in. But are they really doing a justice to everyone else? They're seeing 50 patients a day. Are they really doing justice to those 50 patients? I think you can see where we're going with that. So let me throw this case out at you. Let's go the other way. Timothy is a 27-year-old male. He's indigent, known alcoholic, schizophrenia. He's admitted to the hospital for the 18th time in 8 months. 8 months. He has no insurance. He refuses psychiatric care. He's non-compliant. And the cost of hospitalization so far is $218,000. Now, if you're on the side of healthcare as a right, we would say, who cares? He's entitled. He therefore can use the system. But some others would say, if we have limited resources of $218,000 that's being spent, what happens to those who may need it? And where do you go with this type of patient? And where would you stand? So the question that comes down to is simply this: moral obligation. What's your moral obligation? What's your moral obligation to ensure that everyone has access to at least some level of health care? Now here's where it gets a little dangerous. Why? Because if they are to have some level of care, what level of care is that? Is it a basic universal care? Or is it a higher level of care? Or is it just a little bit of aspirin? Do you see where we're going with that? How do you define level of care? Where do you go? And is it morally right to say to one person who may be indigent, you're only entitled to basic care, which would be Tylenol for your headache. But for someone who may be able to copay, they complain of headache, they get a CT scan for evaluation. Do you see the difference? Now, how do you decide? If you truly have a moral obligation, then the indigent person is entitled to a CT scan as well. And so we begin to start looking at these issues, these principles of ethics, and find find that, in fact, even if they are there for us to use, we don't necessarily use them very well. It is a contentious issue. And so this underlying moral foundation of rights and privileges come down to this. Rights, entitlement. Who's entitled to what? We have children's rights, we have animal rights, we have workers' rights, states' rights, and the rights of people. And having a right suggests to us that therefore we have a duty to provide. And if we believe that, then we throw out everything about healthcare resources, microallocation, macroallocation, and everyone is equal in terms of worth. But what we're seeing is that's not necessarily the case. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that I'm going to be giving you both sides, and it'll be probably hard for you to figure out where I stand, because I want to give you a neutral presentation and give you an opportunity for you to make your own decisions. Right can often be described as a claim. They claim it as such. If you go back to that patient who's a schizophrenic, the indigent who has been in the hospital 18 times, he can declare that he is entitled to that right based on what we call personhood. And he's as worthy as everyone else. Many of you would agree with that. Some others would say, no, he's not compliant, he's chosen not to take his medications, he's determined for himself not to be, quote, a player, and not to take care of himself. So why should we continue to support him? We should just let him be. The argument for that is, how do you deal with the moral distress of knowing what you really should be doing versus what he wants you to do and what others are telling you to do? Here's the problem. The problem is we may agree that health care is a right, especially if we believe in social justice and equality for all. But it's interesting that when it comes down to me, and I put that in quote, it's always I have a right to, as opposed to someone else. Do you see that? When it is personal, regardless of where we stand, I'm entitled, more so than anybody else. And so that kind of throws it all out. It's more about me than the other person. Give an example. Let's go back to our schizophrenic indigent patient. He spent $218,000. You have limited resources. Let's say your budget for your state health fund is $500,000. You just spent almost half of it on this one indigent person. Your father now needs an ICU bed. See where I'm going with this? Now it's all about me, right? It's all about my father. I've just lost the opportunity for him to be in an ICU for an extended period of time because there's not enough money to cover him. But before he got sick, I was saying, yeah, no problem. Let's just go ahead and take care of the schizophrenic. I'm giving you arguments from both sides because I want you to begin to think about it. Privileges are thought to be earned, that it's a special advantage or immunity. Let me give you the arguments why and against. Some arguments supporting this societal obligation to provide care is interesting. It's not based on the obligation of a claimed individual right to health care, but it's based on beneficence, doing good and not doing harm, and the special nature of healthcare needs. And that's the ethics. That's what we call virtue. Virtue is doing good, and you sacrifice yourself in order to do so. That's virtue ethics. That's the virtuous side of what we believe we should be to all others. Some say that the universal access to health care meets fundamental human needs: security, relief from suffering, prevention from unnecessary death. But it also carries risks, so says others. And those risks are many. So we then turn to authorities who give us information to make our decisions. And way back in 1978 through 1983, the Study for Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research came to the conclusion that society has an obligation to ensure that each of its members has access to adequate care without being subject to excessive burdens. And that's where it all kind of started. It all kind of started with that. And so when we look at that, we think, well, that's all good and true, but against the grain of virtue. And so moving forward, another comment that comes out, and here's the key. No decent and compassionate society could fail to provide health care to its members when it has the financial resources to do so. And that's the key component. If we have financial resources to do so, then it wouldn't matter. We have enough unlimited funds to help everybody. And so that appeals to this issue of decency and compassion. However, it's not necessarily always the case. Here's the catch. Here's the catch with all of this. What type of care are we talking about? If we're going to give care to everybody, including the underprivileged. Basic care, standard, or platinum level. I'm going to give you examples of that. And these are legitimate examples. If you are an indigent person that comes into an emergency room complaining of severe headache, frontal, you have some ataxia, the physician is going to think, yeah, boy, this may be a brain tumor, or it could be an aneurysm, something. What I really need to do is do a CT, maybe even MRI, get a neuro consult, and off we go. He has no insurance. And the patient didn't go to a county hospital, went to a private hospital. And the physician's thinking, there's no way I'm going to get approval for this. You see where we're going with this? So what's he going to do? He's going to do his best to make a diagnosis, hope he can give them enough medication to treat them, refer him to a county hospital, hoping that the indigent patient will wind up going there and perhaps get care, and cross his fingers. On the other side, let's say the same person happens to be CEO of a company. Comes in, well, you can guess what type of workup he's going to get, right? Multi-million-dollar workup. Because insurance company is going to cover it. And so that's what it comes down to. And so there's a danger, and this is where I'm coming from. And I'll tip my hand on this one. And that is when we talk and we label individuals as underprivileged, we immediately begin to make them less worthy and we diminish their personhood. So just by labeling them, we put them in a position of having less than others. So if an indigent patient, and let's just take the indigent out, if a patient came into the emergency room complaining of severe frontal headache and ataxia, and you didn't know he was indigent or not, he would get the same care as a CEO of a company. Do you follow that? Can we do that? Are we able to do that? I can tell you society doesn't let us do that. We individually don't let us do that. And this is where I'm going to play hard taskmaster. Why? Because when we look at ourselves in the mirror, whether we like it or not, we are judgmental. We judge others by who we see and what we see. One of the biggest things that I have seen in my practice of medicine and teaching medical students and residents, etc., is the difference between how we describe ourselves as what as opposed to who. So when I put my white coat on, everyone knows what I am. Dr. Beyda, critical care. That's what I am. But does my patient really know who I am? Do you follow that? And one of the things that we need to begin to understand is that in order to have a sound physician-patient relationship without judgment and to eliminate the labeling of the underprivileged is to begin to understand who the other person is. When I make rounds, I can always tell whether the resident, the intern, or the medical student, even a junior attending, is describing the what when he or she starts the presentation. This 16-year-old with ataxia presented last night. See what I just did? As opposed to Jeffrey, who's 16 years old, presented last night with ataxia. That one word made a difference. Do you follow that? That's the big difference. And so that's the who and the what, is that you begin to denigrate if you start labeling. And that comes down to this whole issue of labeling the underprivileged. So with that in mind, if it's easy for us to do that, there's danger. Why? Because if we start denigrating others by labeling them, it becomes very easy for us to begin to ration. Meaning, some are not entitled, some are not going to get what they need. And so we can look at, should we start eliminating, for down to the elderly, the underprivileged, essentially those who no longer serve the land because they are a burden to the youth of society. We know the medical resources are limited, the elderly and those not worthy are consuming a disproportionate amount. And so we can look at the greater good for the greatest number, and that's called utilitarianism. But look at the danger of this. Daniel Callahan, a well-known individual in medical ethics philosophy, proposes and has been proposing since 1937 that elderly individuals, those over 70, who have lived a natural lifespan, should be offered simply comfort care, denied expensive life-sustaining technologies. In other words, if you're 76 and you need a liver transplant, you're not getting it. You're done. There's another definition of this, by the way, and it's called the fair inning rule. And the fair inning rule basically says, if you've played 7 innings of your life, your game's over. You've played the game. It's now time to bring in another team. And so there's danger with this. Why? Because now we're talking about age, denigration, less worthy, and we can then extend that to what? If it is related to those who are not contributing to society, what about the elderly patient with senile dementia, with Alzheimer's? Begin to see? We're now going to start rationing care. Let me come back to one of the very beginning slides where I said, but if it's all about me, it changes. So if my father at 78 needs a liver transplant, this doesn't hold, right? Doesn't hold. Now it may be okay for everybody else, but it doesn't for everybody else outside my family, but it doesn't hold for me. And so when we look at allocation resources, who gets what and why? This here show macroallocation is simply that. It's the total bottom line of a bank account. And that's regulated by insurance companies, legislation, government agencies, etc. But the microallocation is what happens at the bedside. And you may disagree with me, but you may have also done this yourself if you're in the healthcare profession at the bedside. Where, take our case, where our schizophrenic has spent $218,000, and we're saying, that's really not right. Or let's take the 75-year-old who has liver failure and is in an ICU, and we're saying, no, not going to get a liver transplant because we could use that $500,000 for something else, because that's how we talk at the bedside. And whether you believe it or not, that's how it happens. We're making judgments. And the argument and the danger of this is you can say no, but do you really believe that you're going to save that $500,000 and make sure it goes to somewhere where it needs to go? Do you follow what I'm saying? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. You have no control over it. So you may make a value judgment at the bedside saying, this patient isn't worth $500,000 because we could use it for something better. That's as far as you're going to get. So microallocation doesn't work at the bedside unless you're CFO and you are a bank executive. But if you're a healthcare professional at the bedside and you're making those value judgments on your patient based on use of limited resources, there's danger there. And we do so because we judge. So let me take you into some disturbing areas, and I'm going to talk about research and the underprivileged. I'm not going to go into the whole history. I give a whole semester course on research and atrocities. And we're talking hours and hours. I'm just giving you a glimpse. And some of you may be familiar with a lot of this, but bear with me. Because this is the foundation for what we have done to those who are underprivileged and what we are still doing to those who are underprivileged. And it comes down to this era of experimentation. This experimentation and research is interesting because it has potential abuse for the person who is the weakest and the poorest. Because if you're wealthy and you are well-versed, you're not going to find yourself in a situation of being taken advantage of. So let me make sure sure that we understand the difference between experimentation and research. Experimentation is direct observation, it's procedural in nature, it's a process of testing, it's trial and error, but research is the collecting of information. It is the interpretation of facts that we gather, and it is an inquiry that we move forward. And that comes down to who really gains benefits. So who gains the benefits, who bears the burden of experimentation? We'll see. The poor people in hospitals do. They get experimented on, and the upper class benefits from it. Hard words, but history shows it. And so there's questions related to this. And I'm going to throw them out at you. I want you to think about them. I don't necessarily expect you to answer them right now, but I want you to think about them. What should patients be told about treatment procedures proposed to them? And the reason I pose that is, when we get to informed consent, how much information are we going to share with them? How much detail and how should it be communicated? What if a patient is not very sophisticated? Let's say a mentally challenged individual, but still has capacity for decision making. What if a patient is likely to be frightened or refuse treatment that is in his best interest? Are you going to be able to convince him or coerce him into acquiescing? Should an adult ever be treated without or against his consent? If not, why? And if so, when? And if full informed voluntary consent ever possible, how can it be approximated? Well, here's even a better one. So I'm going to take you here too in a little bit. So should research be done in a developing country using protocols that would not be permitted in our country today? And if I give you a minute to think about it, our gut answer to that hopefully should be no. But I'll show you that it's not the case. Do sponsors of pharmaceutical research in developing countries have a responsibility to ensure that research benefits are made available to the local population? The answer to that should be yes. Studies show us that the answer to that is no. It doesn't happen. The local population in a third world country never sees the benefit of the research that's being done on them. I'll show you that in a little bit. Should we use data? Here's a key one. Should we use data that is obtained unethically, even if it yields important and life-saving results? Some would argue, yes. Why? Because it validates those upon whom the research was done, and others would say, no, it goes against the grain of ethics. So I leave you to kind of answer those questions for yourself. Are those who have not enticed to participate? Are they coerced? And I'll show you that in a little bit. And so the danger. Here's the problem with research. And I'm being facetious because I'm kind of getting back into a hard mold here to give you the effect that reality sometimes is difficult to see and accept. When we do research, we are not necessarily always trying to make the patient well, but we're trying to figure out how to make others well. So here's the language that would be used. Not saying word for word, but I think you'll get the idea. Mr. Smith, there's nothing more I can do for you, but you can do something for me. Speaking no longer as your physician, but on behalf of medical science, we could learn a great deal about future cases of this kind if you would permit me to perform certain experiments on you. It is understood that you yourself would not benefit from any knowledge we might gain, but future patients would. It's reality. Now, are we looking towards that person's virtue, to that sense of well-being, to help others? Yes. But it's also a very honest statement. Patients who are on the end of life or who have a serious illness, cancer, what have you, who are undergoing research, many times know that if they are in a double-blind study, the medication they're getting may be a placebo, right? It may not be the real drug that's affecting them, that may be fixing them. And so they know they're taking a chance, but they know they're doing it for others. And so, as long as everyone's upfront about it, we're okay. And this issue of informed consent is a big one. And I'm, like I said, I'm going to be stepping out of bounds a little bit tonight, well, so far a lot. And as a physician, I'm going to share with you that informed consent, as we know it, does not exist. Informed consent is a misnomer. There is no way we can get informed consent in its entirety when we talk with patients. Because to do so, we'd have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We have to explain everything. You can't leave anything out. You have to describe pros and cons. You have to give them alternatives. You have to talk about risks and benefits. There's no way that that's done in its entirety. In fact, what is done is many times, based on the physician, we either embellish the information or we omit. Give me an example. Tell me what you would do in this scenario. I'm a brand new attending. I just finished my fellowship in cardiovascular surgery. So I've had 5 years of general surgery, and I've had another 3 years of cardiovascular fellowship, 8 years of surgical training. I trained at a very high-powered academic institute for cardiovascular surgery. I trained under one of the premier transplant surgeons. A transplant surgeon designed and perfected a very complex surgical procedure to correct a cardiac defect. I assisted him with 3 of the patients when I was a fellow. 2 of our patients died, 1 survived, and then I did 2 additional with him assisting me, and both my patients died. So that's what? 4 out of 5 that have passed away. I'm a new attending in a new town. You are one with this? My patient needs that procedure. Do you think that I'm going to come to you, if you're the mother, and I'm going to say to you, by the way, I've done 5, and 4 of those patients have died, I have 1 survive. Would you give me consent? Probably not. Probably not. But that doesn't mean I have to tell you that. I can just tell you, yeah, I've done 5 cases, and I'm going to do my best to fix your child's heart. Do you follow what we just did with that? All right. So, in honesty, let's say it like it really is. Let's say it like it really is. Siminoff and Fetting in 1991 wrote a nice article, and they said, despite the doctrine of informed consent, it is the physician and not the patient who, in fact, makes the treatment decision. The physician or researcher sometimes gives just enough information to get the answer he wants. Do you follow that? And the more underprivileged you are, the more we label those who are less worthy, the easier it is for us to do. Why? Because we come in as an authoritative figure, and we say, look, here's what I'm going to do. End of story. This is where we're going to go. And it all comes down to that. So informed consent doesn't happen. Even in pediatrics, let me just be very clear, in pediatrics, informed consent cannot exist. Because you can't give informed consent to do something on a child. You get informed permission. There's no such thing as informed consent. You may get assent, but you don't get informed consent in pediatrics. You get informed permission from a parent. And so let me take you through the history. I'm going to give you a disclaimer. Most research is legitimate, ethical, good, and beneficial, but there's a dark side. So let me take you back through the years. And it all comes down to what people have done to each other. And because of that, we've had to develop rules and regulations. The Nuremberg Code, 1948, Helsinki Report, Belmont Report, Ethics Committees, IRBs, etc. So let me take you back. Nazi experiments. This was during World War II. Many of you are familiar with these. We have the high altitude experiments. That's the third picture over, where they take prisoners, they put them in a high altitude chamber, and they change the altitude until the patient essentially died in order to determine at what altitude their pilots would be safe if they had to eject from their airplanes. One of the more controversial ones was what was called the freezing experiments, where they took prisoners and they placed them in ice water baths and left them in there until they started to freeze over and until they passed. And they did that to determine how cold the environment had to be, or would be, before their German soldiers would start being effective. These victims were sometimes in ice water for up to 3 hours and essentially died. Probably one of the most grotesque experiments were the twin experiments with Josef Mengele. I had an opportunity because I was a scholar and a fellow at Georgetown, and so we had the Holocaust Museum there. We had lots of opportunities to interact with survivors. And so I was privileged to speak to many of the survivors and talk about the ethics. And in the twin experiments, I remember vividly talking to one of the prisoners who now lives in the States, who shared with me what she saw. And the twin experiments, what they would do, Josef Mengele was extremely interested to see exactly why twins were twins. And there were two variations of the experiments. One was, and again, I apologize, I'm not being dramatic, I just think it's important for us to understand that they would do an experiment on one, the other twin would be the control, follow. They would then kill both at the same time, do vivisection, and compare. So one child was the control, the other child was the experiment. And they did other things too, which we don't need to get into, but those were the twin experiments, the underprivileged. The Nuremberg trial came up after World War II, and that lasted for a year. And the primary brigadier who attended this wrote the following, and I'll leave you to see that, and that basically was, they were charging the individuals from Germany with war crimes, and horrendous war crimes. 23 German physicians and scientists were accused of performing vile and potential lethal medical experiments between 1933 and 1945. Interestingly enough, Mengele was not among the accused. 15 of the defendants were found guilty, 8 were acquitted. And I'm not going through each one of these individually, but I could, and the stuff that they did was horrendous to those who were underprivileged. 15 were given the death penalty and 8 were imprisoned. Josef Mengele was never apprehended. The story is that he lived for 35 years under various aliases. He went to Paraguay and Brazil until his death in 1979. While he was in Brazil, he went for a swim. He suffered a massive stroke and began to drown, and that's how he passed away. But he escaped. And the most telling statement during the Nuremberg trial was from one of the physicians, Gebhardt, who openly said in court, "Only the precepts of the law, not the principles of medical ethics, can be used to render a verdict." Well, I'm just going to move into another direction and share some information about us. Because sometimes we have a better than now attitude, and that is these value judgments we talk about. At the same time that the United States was prosecuting Nazi government and doctors for crimes against humanity, the U.S. government was supporting research that placed human subjects, the underprivileged, at enormous risk, and had been doing so for years. And I'm going to give you examples. And again, there are so many, and I will leave you to pursue those on your own, but I'm just going to give you a few of them. Let me take you way back to 1913. And again, these are underprivileged individuals who are taken advantage of. The Pennsylvania House of Representatives recorded that 146 children had been inoculated with syphilis. 15 children at St. Vincent's House in Philadelphia had their eyes brushed with tuberculin. Kids became permanently blind. Experimenters were never punished. 1939, 22 children in the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home. Do you see the underprivileged? Vulnerable children, vulnerable people. Subjects of the monster experiment, which was the classical, what we call the Stutter Experiments. Individuals who wanted to find out why kids stutter. It was by one of the most prominent speech pathologists who did this. Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital, 1960s. It's not too long ago. Live cancer cells were injected in senile patients. Notice that? Underprivileged. Less worthy, denigrated, no informed consent. principal investigator was reprimanded. And guess what? Later he was elected president of the American Medical Association. So when I started off by suggesting that we look at ourselves and begin to understand who we are and why we do what we do, we look back at the history. From the 50s to 72, again, not that long ago, mentally disabled, key words, underprivileged, less than worthy. At the Willowbrook School, they were deliberately infected with hepatitis. And here's the key with this one. At that time, there was a large and huge waiting list for mentally handicapped children to get into this institution. And this physician, Saul Krugman, was very interested in studying hepatitis. And so parents, and I'll be right and honest with you, coerced families into signing what was thought to be a consent form to have their children participate in a research project, and then if they did, their kids would be moved to the top of the list. Krugman had some sense of virtue, and so he discussed it with physician colleagues. He actually tried to get approval from the Armed Forces Epidemiologic Board. They approved it, by the way. People approved it. They funded the research, even though they knew what was going on. And later in 1955, after that, a human experimentation committee came and looked at what was happening. They too approved the research. What about the Fernald school study? This is MIT. MIT was working in cooperation with senior members of the Fernald staff. They did nutritional studies with radioisotopes. Again, notice on who? State School for the Mentally Retarded, 1940s to 1950s. You're going to like this. Guess who the company was? Quaker Oats. Quaker Oats was in a race with another company to show that their nutritional value was better. And so they needed to find a way to trace their Quaker Oats going through the gastrointestinal system. And so they contaminated small amounts of food with radioactive iron and calcium, gave it to the students, and figured out, let's see how it got absorbed. Well, there are moral issues to this. Parents, even though they may have been told they were getting informed consent, it was incomplete at best. And so what Quaker Oats was doing was they were in a race against cream of wheat to see who was better with their nutritional values. And it wasn't until 1997 where Quaker Oats finally settled the lawsuit, and 30 of the remaining students who had been affected were awarded an overall settlement of $1.85 million, not each, for all 30. 1997. This is after World War II, after the Nuremberg trial, et cetera, et cetera. Let me go back a little bit. 1940s, 820, again, poor and pregnant Caucasian women were given tracer doses of radioactive iron. They wanted to see whether iron supplements would be of any benefit. And that study served as a foundation for iron supplements that are given to pregnant women today. Tuskegee, you all familiar with that? Perhaps. I'll run right through it. 40-year study, 1932 to 72. African American males, long-term effects of syphilis. Public Health Service really wanted to know what that was all about. It's called bad blood. They were tenant farmers, again, the underprivileged. They were given free medical care by Nurse Rivers and a public health physician. Nurse Rivers had some significant moral distress when penicillin was finally invented, and she wanted to tell those men that there was a cure, but she was told not to, because this study was so important to the Public Health Service because they wanted to see the natural course of syphilis, but they kept that information from these men. So how did they do that? They told the men that this penicillin was really nothing, they really shouldn't listen to all of this, and in fact to make and even sweeter. In those days, if you were an African American male who was living like a tenant farmer, when you were buried, you got buried in a potato sack in an unmarked grave. And so they were enticed, and they were given $50 towards a burial expense, and they were given a marked grave. Informed consent, coercion. It wasn't until 1972 where a researcher said, I can't do this anymore. Moral distress. He blew it. He blew the whistle. Said, this is not where I want to be. Talked to the subcommittee to look at this. They had hearings, revelations, and that's when the IRBs first came out and started looking at research protocols that were peer reviewed. Doesn't get any better though, because a year after that, a civil rights attorney by the name of Fred Gray was approached by one of the survivors, Charlie Pollard. Mr. Gray filed a $1.8 billion class action suit against the U.S. government. Case was never tried. It was settled out of court. You want to talk about justice? You want to talk about veracity? You want to talk about care for the underprivileged and those who would be less worthy? 1974, the government agreed to pay $37,500 to each of the survivors and $15,000 to the families of the men who had died. They got free medical care, but look what the attorney got, $1 million. And the apology didn't come until May 16, 1997. And that's when the formation of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission was formed. A key investigator, a virologist, Thomas Rivers, who was at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in 1967 in his memoirs wrote, and here's the scary part. He wrote, the law winks when a reputable man wants to do a scientific experiment. And down at the bottom he says, unless the law winks occasionally, you have no progress in medicine. So you remember those 5 principles I shared with you about ethics? They don't exist. Why? Because when it is convenient for us, we look away and someone winks. And you would think that we would learn the lesson from World War II. So one day we're in Nuremberg and we are blasting these German physicians for doing what they did and calling them monsters. And guess what? On the other side, Unit 731, which was a Japanese death camp, had been identified at the very end of the war. It was a death camp, and it was used for biological warfare research that the Japanese were doing. It was the very end of the war, like the last few days, right before Japan surrendered. U.S. troops found 150 buildings. 3 to 4 of them were used for human dissection. There were 4,000 incubators for bacterial growth. Each one of those was producing 100 kilograms. An example of what that means. If you remember the cholera endemic in Haiti, I went there for that after I was there for the earthquake, like within hours, and then went back to the cholera endemic. Give you an example what 100 kilos of cholera does. If I was to take one drop, just a drop from a dropper of cholera and put it in the water system, we would affect tens of thousands of people with cholera. They were producing 100 kilos of this stuff. Right? Well, when we found it, MacArthur said, it's interesting, and he gave that Japanese commander a dispensation. He made a deal. Give me your research, and we won't prosecute you. He said, and I quote, data is of such importance as to outweigh the crime issue. Did we do anything with that data? We did. From January to July of 1952, during the Korean War and in China, we spread 18 species of bacteria carrying insects that we learned about from those Japanese death camps. We used that information. 1995, just a little while ago, Fenfluramine Experiments. Minority children, again, the underprivileged, age 6 to 11, were exposed to fenfluramine in a non-therapeutic experiment, neurotoxic drug. And we go on and on. But the ones that really stand out, if these don't stand out enough for you, are the radiation experimentation in the United States. A whistleblower came up, and this came about because of the plutonium experiment thing. 4 months before the bombs were dropped on Japan, we know that the Manhattan Project was going on, there was human experiments going on, and finally, Eileen Welsome blew the whistle, published in the Tribune, and wrote a book called The Plutonium Experiment, The Plutonium Files, and as a result, the Atomic Energy Commission finally, just 10 years ago, published a 4-big book manual of all the experiments they had done on U.S. citizens without their knowledge. Over a 30-year period between 1940 and 1970, 4,000 controversial radiation experiments involving tens of thousands of subjects, many who were not informed, were done. I'm just giving you some of this. And it continues. And there's more recent cases. They're more individual in a sense. But even with IRBs and ethics committees, we still find ways to take advantage of the underprivileged and the less worthy. So now I'm going to take you on a trip. And I'm going to take you overseas. I'm going to take you to a third world country, some of them, and share with you how even easier it is to take advantage of those who openly are underprivileged and considered less worthy. This is a picture I took in a very small remote village of Haiti. 2 kids found abandoned. We pulled them into our NGO and took care of them. And this next picture is also a small village, but you can see all the trash. This is what the kids live in. And can you imagine when a U.S. researcher walks into an environment like this, how easy it is for a local population to say, yes, I'll take whatever you're going to give me. Do you follow? How easy it is to do that. And so I'm going to pose the question, what is global health? It's realistic medical care for the significantly underprivileged. And what we have is more than good, and what they have is more than bad. And unfortunately, there are a few who take advantage of that. And here's some of the patients that I've taken care of. And you tell me how easy you think it would be to take advantage of someone like this when they're looking for help. They have nothing. And so researchers can go in there, or anybody can go in there and say, if you do this for me, I will give you something. And something could be as simple as a meal, could be as simple as a token of $1. And in many situations, the local population, the village community, is illiterate, so what they will do is they will refer and defer decisions to who? Their chief. And so the negotiation for the research will be done with the chief, who then gives authority for consent for everybody in the village. And that's done easily. I've seen it happen, where a chief is walking around with a gold Rolex, probably fake, or more than likely fake. You can't even tell time, but he's wearing a watch. Follow where we're going? That. Or local doctors, and I'll share this in a moment again, probably. Local doctors are asked to participate, and they're making $3 to $4 a day, and they're offered $10 a day if they have their patients participate. They're living a high life, and so they'll do it. And so I asked the question, why are global health disparities morally problematic? Primarily because if we believe in